Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. God calls us to live missionally, but what exactly does that look like? Do we have to sell everything and head to a foreign country? For Christians who long to serve God in broken places but aren't sure where to start, this new book, The Mission-Centered Life, Following Jesus into the Broken Places, is a new 10-week group resource organized into 10 lessons designed for readers who want to explore their role in building the kingdom of Christ. Readers will consider how the gospel propels them to go out and love their neighbors, including people who might be far away or very different from those they usually encounter in everyday life. This is an in-depth study which explores why holistic missions are needed, how God's grace empowers us to serve in places of need, what to do when we fail as missionaries, and how to cultivate hope in the midst of a broken world. Bethany Ferguson, with a Master's of Arts, has spent most of the last 15 years serving with Surge in Uganda, South Sudan, and Kenya. Originally from South Carolina, Bethany studied elementary education at the College of Charleston and went on to receive a master's degree in counseling from Westminster Seminary. After completing her master's, she's continued her professional training through Biblical Seminary's professional counseling program. Her cross-cultural work focuses on promoting education and mental health care for children and adolescents in under-resourced areas. She's passionate about supporting churches and schools. She's led discipleship programs at Christ Church in Buddy Bugyo, taught HIV/AIDS prevention at Buddy Malinga Primary School, trained primary school teachers in South Sudan, and equipped lay counselors in the Sudanese church. She's also taught missionary kids in Uganda and counseled third culture kids and their families in Kenya. She's currently pursuing a PhD in clinical psychology from Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. Here to discuss her new book, The Mission-Centered Life, Following Jesus into the Broken Places, is Bethany Ferguson. Bethany, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's exciting because it's a brand new subject for me. It's a brand new topic for me. It's something that I know nothing firsthand about, having grown up in the synagogue, and then coming to faith in a Messianic synagogue. The concept of hearing about church mission boards and the Baptist Mission Board, International Missions Boards, and the calling to go out, begs the question of who's the missionary here? And, statistically, it's kind of interesting because the South Korean church has America as number 3 on their missions list of countries to evangelize. So it's kind of a perspective as to who has the need. The South Korean church says America has the need. The American church says that Guatemala and Honduras and Central and South America and Africa have the need. And so, wow, it's quite a diverse perspective that each one is saying we should go out to serve the needs in these other countries, but every country on the map has needs, and every country on the map has missionaries from different places going to it. It kind of begs the question philosophically, if everybody is going out and all the places are having foreigners come in, why don't you just stay home and fix it at home? Which is kind of my logical Hebrew brain that says, if everybody is flying everywhere, wouldn't we be saving a whole lot of money if we just stuck it right in our communities and made the local community the mission? So before we dig into that, which is kind of a lofty kind of discussion, and one that will come up as you delve more into the philosophical aspects of your training in clinical psychology, which I've had plenty of training and experience in myself. So you get to have these conversations and talk about the social mindset and social construct. But is this something you grew up in? Is this something that was family-centric? Did you catch the vision as a child? What was it that really influenced you from a faith perspective, and then extending that to actually answering the most basic instruction that Jesus gave, which was, now go out and preach the good news. So where did it begin?
Well, I did grow up in a Christian family. I did not grow up in a international missions background, but I grew up, my dad was a pastor for much of my childhood, and my mom was an English teacher, so I grew up in a family with a love of God's word and a love of story, I think, which gave me a rich connection to the big story that God is writing all over the world of his coming kingdom. And so when I was in college, I had the opportunity to travel to Ukraine, and that was my first international experience with a missional focus. I went to teach English as a second language, and being in a part of the world that was a part of the former Soviet Union and had experienced a lot of oppression, and then getting the opportunity to I taught a beginning English class, so a lot of babushkas who had never studied any English before, and they would come, and I had done my training in ESL.
Can I just interject
Sure.
and interrupt you? That is
Yes.
my family's history, and that was my first
Really?
first trip to go preach the gospel in Odessa to Holocaust survivors.
Wow.
And to the remnant of the Jewish community, a very decimated Jewish community in Odessa, and went to Kiev and to Babi Yar. So our starting
Wow, that's so cool.
Our starting point. That's where my family's from.
Yeah.
And emigrated here in the early 1900s from southern Poland, western Ukraine. And the fact that that's where you would have gone, I know exactly where you were, what you were doing, who you were talking to. It's really quite interesting. So it's a great connection. So
Yeah. It's in the little village of Nikolaev. I don't know if you know where that is. I flew into Odessa, but
Nikolaev is the birthplace of ultra-Orthodox Judaism. That's the Lubavitch movement you see in Israel with the long black coats and the big black hats. That was Menachem Mendel Schneerson, that was from Nikolaev. So that's where ultra-Orthodox
Judaism. That you know that.
Yeah, that's where it was born. That's where it birthed in Nikolaev. So I have many good friends in Nikolaev. So sorry to interrupt you, but I couldn't miss this opportunity to bond with you at that level.
We were in the same geographic location. So, I was a sophomore in college. I was probably 19, but I also did have a professor at that point. I was at a state university, and for one of my history classes, I had a Jewish professor who also had roots connected to Ukraine, and he was very offended that I would go to do a trip like that. I was doing a research paper on Ukraine because I wanted to learn about it before I went, and I remember him talking to me about, was I manipulating people? Was I going to teach English as a way to then force my faith on them? And that was really a big wrestling point for me in thinking about missions, because that's not what we did. We offered English training as a part of showing the love of Christ. But I think when you think about mission, there is a way that God calls us to also be his witnesses in the world. And you think about the tragedies that have happened in places like Ukraine. For me to witness the tenacity and beauty of the people I interacted with, to get to live out my faith in an authentic way, but also with trust of God's Spirit, that as I grow in seeing his work in the world, he shows me my need of him, and then that overflows more naturally. So I think that started my particular interest in mission that serves those who are underserved, and that also provides generosity, resources, and also bears witness to places that are often not seen in the world, and places that are often hidden, overlooked, oppressed, or forgotten. So that's how I got started initially. And then when I graduated from college, I taught elementary school for a couple of years in St. Louis. And while I was there, I heard about a need for a teacher in Western Uganda. I did not even know where Uganda was on a map. I sort of thought I would settle into my, American life and, buy my house, get married, have 2.5 kids and a dog. And then this opportunity came up, and I looked around and saw that a lot of people around me did not have the freedom to go overseas at that point. And I did. I had the flexibility to be able to travel, the interest in a place like Uganda. And so I would like to tell you that I had like a lot of deep thoughts about what mission meant at 22 years old, but
Right.
I kind of thought, oh, here's this need in Uganda. It matches my gifting and calling, and I'm going to go. So you're looking puzzled. Was that a puzzling way to answer that?
No, it was actually, um, transparency in our faith walk. It is literally what Jesus says. Unless you come to me as little children, unless you come with this lack of understanding of the complexity of the scriptures, unless you come to me with this lightness about you, not this heavy yoke of the law, not this heavy teaching of the Pharisees, but unless you come to me with naivete and with just freedom, and you say, wow, well they have a need, I think I'll go. That's exactly, and that was my response to that, that's exactly the living, breathing exemplification of what Jesus was talking about. Is don't get caught up in the theology, don't get caught up in the ideology, don't get caught up in the doctrine. You hear a need, give to the one who asked you, and don't expect to be repaid. You heard about a need, and you said, I'll go. That's the model of Jesus. We have so lost that, and so it's so pure, it's so perfect in its construct that I want to make sure that people understand this is what he was talking about. Is not to process and overanalyze, and this evaluation of divesting myself of all my worldly possessions and Dr. Livingston, I presume, to hear of a need, and if it pierces your spirit, believe that it's from God, and say, here I am, send me. It's just that simple.
And that complex, right? I
Yes.
really appreciate your kindness in saying that. I will say moving to Uganda did totally disrupt my world. So I moved to a really rural village right on the border of Congo, and it had been plagued by a lot of violence. It was among a people group that was fairly isolated because of the Rwenzori Mountains. And, I'm a suburban girl from South Carolina. I had not really witnessed suffering like I saw in Bundibugyo before I moved there. And so a lot of that naivete was then confronted with some of the hard realities of the world, particularly with friends that I really loved and cared about. I had a close Ugandan friend whose newborn baby died on, I think it was Christmas Eve. So on Christmas Day, I was going to a funeral and also celebrating the birth of Jesus. And I just remember that experience of wondering, how does Jesus matter? Here we are more than 2,000 years later. Jesus has come and babies are still dying from diseases that would be treatable in other parts of the world. So that stirred up a lot of theological questions, maybe the ones I didn't think about before I got to Uganda. And yet I also had this rich experience of God's Spirit meeting me in really needy places when I felt lonely, disconnected from my family. And I had a real need for Ugandan community, I think, that I didn't expect to have. And so there was a way that I thought I was going to serve and then found myself being served and cared for, and this really beautiful mutuality of connection that I think is what missions really is all about. And we sometimes miss in talking about, like, let's go and help people, rather than realizing we're not going to save or help anyone. We're reflecting Jesus, who's the true Savior, and that's a privilege to do that. So it was such a great, I lived in Bundibugyo for a little over 2 years, and it transformed my life, right? It redirected it into this life of work in East Africa. It built some of my solid lifelong relationships. And it also, I think, probably made me into a lifelong learner, right? As I got there, and there were so many big questions about development, mission, questions I still wrestle with today. So anyway, that's how I first got to East Africa.
So you heard there was a need. Now, was there a group you affiliated with and they sponsored you, or you had to raise your own support? Was there how does it work?
Good question. So I have been with Surge, who's the group that I published my book with, since that point, I went with Surge to Uganda. So I've been with them since 2003. And I did raise financial support through churches and community and friends to cover the cost of going. So that's kind of how the financial and like prayer support and communal piece, it was really important for me. I felt like I was going to bear witness to the truth of Jesus in Uganda, but I also wanted to reflect a similar witness back to the United States, to my friends and family. I think when you talk about living in some of the places I've lived, it sounds really exotic or scary, or it's hard to make it feel real to people. And I felt like it was really important to be a picture of the real life that happens anywhere in the world and the places I was living. So yes, I did raise financial support. I had a community of people that prayed for me regularly. Some people came and visited me. And then I did that through Surge, which has a nonprofit status. And that's kind of how I raised the money.
You traveled there. Did you travel with other Americans, or did you have a small group that you were kind of connected to, and that's where you kind of you had your base and kind of your English and American connection, and were they a support system for you? Did they help guide you in how to connect with cultural differences? Was there different levels of seniority or mentorship involved locally for you?
Yeah, so Surge has a team base or team mentality, so they don't usually send people out by themselves to different geographic regions. So I was a part of the team. I did travel by myself, and I didn't know anyone on this team before I got there, so that was a little scary for me. But there were several other families, and working in lots of multidisciplinary areas. So some people were a part of coming alongside Ugandan church planters. Some people were doing water ministry, so there wasn't running water in the village where I was at that point. There is now. There wasn't electricity. Several people were working in healthcare and working in the local community health center, and there was a hospital in Bundabugyo town, which was a few miles away from us. And so, yes, those people were my friends and mentors. We did life together. I learned about all kinds of things. I had a kerosene fridge and a latrine, and had to learn how to deal with like rats and spiders and scorpions in my house. So I had a lot of, yes, spiritual mentorship and also life mentorship. And then I had also very kind Ugandan friends who had known other Americans coming through, so they also would help me. I had language helpers and teachers, and did homestays to learn more about Ugandan, well, not Ugandan, Babwisi, culture, just so I could be more connected to the community. So yes, I had an American team, and we would have weekly prayer times together and worship times, ways to connect and support each other. And then I had a really great Ugandan community as well.
As you were integrating into the community and teaching English, you weren't there to evangelize, but you were there
Right.
to be an evangelist. There's a difference. To be an evangelist, you are the example of Christ. To evangelize, I mean, it's spoken. This is how I evangelize. I go out and I preach a message. But to be a true evangelist means that you are the living model. It's the whole package. It's it's when the flood comes. It's when the drought comes. It's when the famine comes. It's when you have your first snake encounter. You have your first spider encounter. You have your first trouble in the community encounter, because there is trouble in these communities. There is everything from the warlords to the rebels to what we would consider to be gangs, people stealing food from others because of the shortages. You're dealing with all of that, and how do you respond? How do you respond in love, and how do you respond? And does it take you to the edge of your faith? And is your faith being tested? Was this your Genesis 22 moment in your life of laying your life on the altar and believing that you were going to give yourself as a living sacrifice, and that God was going to bring out and fulfill his redemptive plan for you in the strange land that, just like God told Abraham, that you will be a stranger in a strange land, a foreigner among the nations?
Yeah, I would say it for sure started in Bundabugyo. It was, I think, if you had seen me at that season, I was just like wide-eyed all the time, right? Trying to figure out what is happening, how do I understand God? And so I was in Bundabugyo, and then I came back to get my master's in counseling at Westminster. And a lot of the reason I chose to pursue a counseling degree at a seminary is I was really wrestling with who is God in a world where there's so much loss and injustice. I had I had just a lot of friends who died. I went to a lot of funerals. I had friends who were, existing on less than $1 a day, who maybe didn't have a pair of shoes, things like that, that sound kind of like the ways we caricature situations in East Africa. And yet these were friends who were loving and generous and warm. I also had conflict with people, right? It's not like you step into a situation like this and become a holy person. So my sin definitely showed up as I had cross-cultural misunderstandings, as I felt just the kind of the physicality of life. But I would say I experienced it even more when I moved to South Sudan. So I lived in Uganda for 2 years, but I moved to South Sudan in 2009, right when it was becoming an independent country. And that's where the majority of my cross-cultural work has been. And I think that my life there was really difficult because we had a lot of hope in 2009 when it was separating and becoming an independent nation. And then it has since fallen back into civil war and is one of the poorest and most dangerous countries in the world. And so I think that's really been a place of wrestling for me, to wonder, what's God doing in South Sudan, to have friends in refugee camps, to have a place that I really invested in and cared about. So I didn't mean to jump ahead with your question, but I think those questions started in Uganda, and then I experienced them more fully during my time in Sudan.
As you were doing this, because here you are and most people don't really realize that the Bible only speaks about 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe. Those are only 3 continents mentioned in Scripture. And Sudan is mentioned specifically in reference to the Ezekiel 38-39 coalition of Gog Magog and prophetic. You were in the heart of a prophetic landscape, if you will. We see the Islamization, the rise in when you were in Ukraine. You were in Ukraine at a time where Ukraine was trying to get its identity, and the cry of Ukraine was, boy, if this is what independence from the former Soviet Union is like, we want to go back, because we knew we were better off. We were treated better under the communist system. Now we're having to, the average wage is $214 a month in Ukraine. That's the average earnings. And so when government subsidies started going away and people started worrying about how am I going to get and pay for heat in the severity of winter and all those things. And then you go into Sudan, you go into Uganda and then into Sudan, and you're seeing abject poverty. You're seeing what the world does not see, the media will not cover, because it is a commentary on our human failure to provide, to meet the needs, to serve. It's just a gaping hole. But then we have pictures of Baltimore, and we have pictures of Los Angeles and San Francisco.
Yes,
and the squalor is no different than what we would say is in a third world country. And although there are those that are making a huge deal out of this reference to an American city being like a third world country, it's true. There are no waste processing systems. You had a latrine
Yeah.
You had to go to the river to get water, or you had to go to the well to get water. You didn't have the kind of plumbing that we have. You had that in Nikolaev, but you didn't have that in Uganda or especially in Sudan.
Yeah.
So the mission-centered life, is it something that for you, which has been, it's not periodic, it's not intermittent, it is kind of seasonal for you to work in the field, gain more skills? Do you think you'll go back to the field?
I mean, that's a good question. It's good that you're bringing up LA, right? I mean, because I'm living right outside of Los Angeles right now, and there are 35,000 children in foster care in Los Angeles. There are more in the county I live in than any other state in the country. And so when I think about the mission-centered life, I think one hesitancy I have about talking about my experience is that sometimes people feel like I'm then saying, so you should have the same experience as me, or you should then move to the end. That is not what I'm saying. I believe that God's Spirit is actively at work in the hearts and lives of his children, and he is directing us to live, to love our neighbor wherever our neighbor is, right? And if you are having trouble loving your actual physical neighbor next door, that's the place to start, right? And so for me, you've heard a little bit about my story. A lot of my faith has been take one more step, right? Like make the phone call to find out about Uganda, go to an interview about it, agree to move to Uganda for a year, extend that to 2 years. So I know that there are other people who've had missions experiences where the Lord clearly directs them from 6 years old and they know, but my faith journey has been a little light on the path for the next step. But I also think it changes how I live currently in Los Angeles, right? My thoughts about loving my neighbor, trying to connect with the community around me, which is very diverse, people from all over the world, people in lots of challenging economic situations. LA is one of the easiest cities in the world to slide into homelessness because of the expense of living here. And I think my years living overseas, God's Spirit has grown my attentiveness to some of those things in a way that they wouldn't have been had I not had that. And so my hope for believers is that we'll be open to moving towards people who are different than us, and that we will especially be drawn to the peripheral people, right? Jesus calls us, and the Old Testament calls us to remember the widow and the foreigner and the children, like the poor are always with us. And so I think to default in that direction of care. And you're right, that we can do it all over the world. I mean, I also think people should consider moving geographically, but I think the place that you start is by encountering the world as it shows up on your door. And I think people could walk down their street and have a similar loving of the neighbor encounter if they're awake to look for that.
We're talking with Bethany Ferguson, author of the new book, The Mission-Centered Life, Following Jesus into the Broken Places. What are those broken places? Do they have to be in a third world country? Do they have to be 8,000 miles away and take you out of your comfort zone to a place where they don't speak the same language and you have to learn new foods and you have to get shots and visas and permissions to go? Or could it very well be that Jesus wants us to have an eye for the brokenhearted, an eye and a heart for those who are downtrodden, for those who are in need wherever they may be? And that if you're being called to the mission field, then is it a local call or is it a long distance call? And that's an answer that you can only find out for yourself. We're going to delve more into the content of the Mission-Centered Life with Bethany Ferguson after this short break. Not everything that makes the headlines has biblical importance, but many events that happen around the world do, and you never hear about them. Igniting a Nation is pleased to teach Revealing Prophecy every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at the Marriott 280 in Birmingham. We will cover worldwide events and insider information that will connect the dots of what's happening around the world with biblical prophecy. If you happen to miss a class, we'll televise each week's class at 10 o'clock Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our social media outlets. Copies of the teachings will also be available to purchase on our website at www.ignitinganation.com. The Lord meets you right where you are, and so does Igniting a Nation's new live streaming outlets. You can now watch Revealing the Truth, Revealing the Bible, and Prophecy Revealed simulcast live each Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube Live, Facebook Live, Vimeo, Periscope, and through our website, www.ignitinganation.com. No matter what device you are using, our program will automatically scale so you won't have to miss a single program. And if you happen to miss an episode, you can always subscribe to the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel and access over 1,000 interviews and never miss your favorite authors, special guests, and topics that interest you the most.
There are lots of ways to see Israel, but nothing compares to seeing the land of the book and the people of the book through the eyes of two Jewish believers who can take you on a journey that will bring the entire Bible to life. When you join Rabbi Eric Walker and his #1 rated tour guide, Edo Canaan, in Israel, you'll experience incredible teachings, first-class accommodations, and actually walk where Jesus walked. You will experience the Bible transforming from black and white into living color, and you will never see the Bible in the same way again. For more information, visit us at www.ignitinganation.com/events.
The Lord contends with what contends with you, and Igniting a Nation is committed to bringing to light each and every issue that faces a believer's life. Our live stream programming and teachings take you on a journey to finding biblical truth from a wide variety of experts who share their insights into a deeper walk with the Lord. We have assembled the most comprehensive panel of experts in the fields of prophecy, caregiving, healing from trauma, shame, and abuse, and so much more. We continue to expand our teachings and programming to meet your needs. We're committed to healing the nations with biblical truth. Visit www.ignitinganation.com to develop a deeper walk with the Lord and start your journey to a transformed life. The Bible commands us to study to show ourselves approved, but most study using Bible study tools and not actually studying the Bible chapter and verse. Igniting a Nation is pleased to present Revealing the Bible, recorded and taught each week before a live audience. We take you deeper into the actual Bible and verse in both Hebrew and English and connect the dots between the Old and New Testament. You can attend our 2 classes in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, or watch the program every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our other simulcast outlets. For more information, visit www.ignitinganation.com/events. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Bethany Ferguson, author of The Mission-Centered Life, Following Jesus into the Broken Places. Bethany, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Bethany, we are talking about your progression of where you started out with a mission trip as a student to Ukraine to answer the call to teach English, ultimately wound up in Uganda, and then in Sudan, and now you're back getting your PhD in clinical psychology. Is it your hope that you will be able to apply some of the clinical psychology to assisting and preparing others for the mission field? Because there's a part of the psyche, the mind, the whole experience of leaving behind what we know and going into what we don't know and helping and assisting in that area, or are you really being led into a whole new area of clinical psychology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I came back to school because my time overseas had raised a lot of questions for me. In my time in South Sudan, I was training primary school teachers and tried to do some psychosocial training as well, and I found there wasn't a whole lot of psychological research on how to help groups that have had traumatic experiences in places like South Sudan, where violence and instability would be ongoing. And so that started growing a research interest for me as I looked for resources and didn't find a lot. And then I had been working at an international school in Kenya, where I was a school counselor for third culture kids, many of whom their parents were missionaries. And it was a American curriculum at the school, so a lot of the students were hoping to study in the United States. And as I worked as their counselor, I also grew in my interest in supporting missionaries, military families, families that live cross-culturally. And so in school, I have kind of that dual interest, both of doing research about trauma, burnout, resilience in areas that are under-resourced, and then also helping people who want to serve in those resources by working professionally as a therapist, but also doing more research into that. So, and of course, you come into school with one set of ideas, and then as you're learning and growing, I think God may direct different paths. So I don't know what it will look like coming out of school. I am trusting even the process of research that will be beneficial, I hope, and useful for other people. And I'm not sure. I would love to be back in East Africa, but like you said at the beginning, there's also a lot of needs here in the United States. And so I really am trusting God's Spirit to clarify vocationally what it will look like once I finish my degree program.
In writing this study, how did you decide on what were the valuable lessons? This is your harvest. You had a season of sowing, you had a season of nurturing, you had a series of transplanting, and out of all of that, you harvested a series of very profound lessons to prepare people to have a mission-centered life. But within each one of these areas, there are lessons that you are hoping to impart and to take people through the journey. So what were the lessons that you chose? Why did you choose them? And what do you hope the outcome would be?
Yeah, I think as I had wrestled in different seasons of my time overseas, I would often read resources written about missions that were written kind of starting out, and they would feel very inspirational and sort of encourage people to go out and save the world or like live on the edge for Jesus. And I felt as though that is actually not a long-term motivator for anyone. And I think long-term overseas, I started watching people wrestle and struggle with who is God in a world of suffering. What does it mean to trust God with your children, with your family back in your home country? And I think also as I developed really deep and meaningful cross-cultural relationships, I wanted people to see missions not as us going out to meet other people's needs, but as another opportunity for us to see our own need for Christ. Because the most profound experience for me in living missionally is that every time I would connect with something challenging, when I had friends unable to afford their school fees, or when I had friends pass away, when I had conflict with a teammate, I always had an opportunity to turn towards Christ again, right? In repentance, to return to Him and receive what I needed by faith. And I think the main thing I hope from this book is for people to see that the broken places often are inside of us first, right? That God calls us to encounter Him in our own struggle and need and weakness. And then that transforms us and frees us to love other people and point them to Jesus, who also meets their needs. And so I wanted to put that in a book, but also in a narrative form that I hope honors my experience overseas and doesn't paint it as more dramatic than it was, but that is honest and real about the struggles, but also that shows people the beauty of moving out in risk and faith to love the world that God has given us.
Do you feel that people are uniquely gifted in this area, that there are those that God has ordained? There's so many that I find that when I talk to them and interview them about them being in the ministry, they say, well, that was just the course of events. My father was a pastor, so I was expected to be a pastor. So when I went to high school, I knew I was going to be a pastor, and I knew I was going to go to the seminary that my father went to, and so it was a job. It was a vocation, and there's great safety in, you graduate, you apply, you get a job as a youth pastor, or a student pastor, or associate pastor, and you kind of work your way through the ranks, and you wind up hopefully having your own church, and you're successful, and you find fulfillment in that. But it's a job. It's the job that you do. You get a paycheck for it.
Yeah.
It's the job you do. You have a board, so you have a hiring committee, and that's who you answer to. The mission field is something that seems to be quite different, that you have to have a certain amount of selflessness. You can't be a pastor without being selfless. The ones who are called seem to embrace the fullness of the calling in a much more, I don't want to say dramatic way or large way, but they seem to be more intimately involved. The hours are easier when you're called than when you plan to do it. And I'm sure it's that way in the mission field as well. You become more malleable, more flexible, more open to change, more resilient. If you're called to it, then it's just something to do. How does one know that they're called to missions? What would you say to the audience that says that, when should I dabble? Well, if I hear about a school group, I hear about a youth group, I hear about a camp group, I hear about a group that's willing to go. I just had one of my board members' daughters who's 19. She just spent 9 weeks in Tajikistan, or one of the stands. And it changed her life. She made all kinds of new friends. It was very much spirit-filled, but it was an incredible social encounter for her as well. When do you recommend, from this standpoint of one, who's the audience for the book? Is it the parent, or is it the young person searching? Is it the pastor who is in need of trying to convey the messages to people getting involved in missions? Or because this is not a short-term mission model. This is not the 10-day model. This is the mission field where you go out and you relocate and you spend years, possibly decades, in this field. So how did you approach that in the book?
Yeah, I mean, my hope would be that the audience would be all of those people you mentioned in different ways. And the way the book is structured is it is a series of essays connected to my personal experience in different geographic locations and how Jesus met me there. So my hope would be that people would read it and then think, how have they seen Jesus meet them in their own personal experiences, right? So I talk about an experience in Uganda where one of my neighbors stole a papaya off my tree and how mad I got about that. So I hope somebody doesn't read it and think, oh, I should move to Uganda so someone can steal a papaya from me. I hope that they think, oh, how did I respond when someone cut me off in traffic today because of those similarities? Because I think as believers, God has saved us holistically, right? Body, mind, soul, spirit, and he uses our interest, our experience, our opportunities to lead us into calling. And so I think anyone who's curious, who has some interest, should take the next step, whether that means finding a friend to pray with you about it, reading more about what you're interested in. And I know some people it is a geographic location, some people it's a certain need, right? Human trafficking or orphan care or work in urban settings. I think for me, a lot of life has been, what's just the next step that you take? And of course, I'm telling you the direction I went, but there are other steps forward I've taken that then God closes the door. After I had been in Sudan and moved to Kenya, I thought God was calling me back to South Sudan. I had made a plan to return there and lead a team of people. And then the Civil War returned and they came in and all of the homes we built were destroyed and looted. And God closed that door of opportunity even though I had pursued it. And so I think we can trust God's Spirit to keep directing us as we take steps forward. And I really hope people in reading the book will see it applying to their life today rather than seeing it as any kind of pressure that their life should look like my life has looked.
And that is to be expected and appreciated. The message of the book is to really broaden your horizons and understand what a kingdom mind means and how it breaks down into the mission-centered aspect of it, but it does not preclude you from being missional in your local community. And maybe that is the starting point. Maybe that is the building point. As you looked at from a Bible study perspective, you have a lot from the Gospel of John, which kind of laid out kind of the I want to say the seeing, the believing, the serving is really the three chapters you have most of the references to the Gospel of John in. You talk about the need to see and then seeing God's work in you. We're a pretty self-centered society here in America. We're pretty self-focused on our own needs. That's enough about me, what about me? Where do we turn the corner on making ourselves available when we really get on our knees and say, I don't know what you want me to do, but if you'll show me the way, I'll go that way. And the answer comes back, there's a need in Uganda, there's a need in Belarusia, there's a need in Odessa, Nikolaev, in Kiev, there's needs all over. There's orphanages, 30 million orphan children on the Ganges River, the Tibet border of India, and very few Christian organizations there taking care of those 30 million orphans. Just a few orphanages built and just trying to get them food, and the numbers who are being eaten by crocodiles every day, they lose track of because they just can't keep up with the need. So there's such a great need. How do we evaluate those needs versus the local community need?
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, it looked like it froze for a minute. I think that's the million-dollar question, right? We're in a world where there are more needs than we know what to do with, and I think that's one way that we keep our faith humble, right? Jesus is the Savior. He's redeeming and making the world new, and our call is to live in community and love with the world. And so I think one way is by remembering we're not alone, right? I have loved being a part of a Surge community. I have loved being a part of different seminary experiences, training experiences, living in different parts of the world, because it makes me realize that it's not up to me, right? We together as the body of Christ are reflecting the love of Christ to a needy world. And so I would never say, oh, you shouldn't think about the needs at home, or you shouldn't think about the needs internationally, because yes, we're called to engage with all of them, but we also have trust that I trust that God led me to Sudan. I couldn't live in Sudan and also live on the Ganges River and also live here in urban Los Angeles at the same time, because we're limited people, which God in his kindness reminds us of. So I wish I could give you the million-dollar answer, how do you know where you should go or when, but I think that's part, actually, not to plug my book, but the mission-centered life in pushing you into your deepening relationship with Christ, because I think that transformed people transform the world. And so if I'm just thinking about how can I fix things, I'm going to be stuck. But if I, day in and day out, am walking by faith and in love with Jesus, that's going to naturally start to overflow in the directions I go. And of course, you have wise counsel around you. I think finding I see a therapist, I have mentors that I meet with, lots of other people who are reflecting back and speaking truth into my life, people who've known me for a long period of time. So I think all those resources are so important, but the baseline is that hidden personal relationship with Jesus and how that then directs our steps about where to go.
As I navigate through this study and I find myself interested in pursuing a deeper understanding of the needs globally, can I approach it and say, if I can gather some of the skills necessary to really understand the mission field, I actually can go collect those, get trained in a third world country, get trained in a remote location where I don't have the day-to-day distractions, I don't have all the texting and all the entertainment. I can actually focus on the work so that I can prepare myself to come back and then integrate back into American society, but have a mission mind for my local community because I've experienced. And if we look at it as a training ground, if we look at it as an area of preparation, as it was in your life, it was where you were shaped, formed, refined, challenged, your faith was stretched, you began to analyze where you needed shored up in your understanding of the gospel message and what it means to be the hands and feet of Messiah. You came to the crossroads of, do I want to be this permanently, or does the mission mind reaching the broken world, does that actually, is that actually broader? Is it actually, do we do a disservice by looking at missions only one way?
Yeah, I think for sure that, and I feel that especially as some, people are sort of like, I don't want to become a Christian because God's going to send me to a remote part of Africa, and so I'm kind of the image of that. But I think too, I want people to realize that it isn't as different as you think on the one hand. And you were sort of saying you could go to a remote setting and not have distractions. I would say life there is so physically hard, right? Cooking food, building so many parts of it. I often felt like my day, I didn't get nearly as much done in a day in some ways in a place that wasn't as focused on efficiency and that also was harder living. So I don't know that particularly I would say you should go overseas so you could come back to the States. But I do believe that each season of our life equips and prepares us for the next one. So it may be that for some, I have friends I've worked with in Kenya who worked in the US their whole life and then in retirement have moved to work in a hospital in Kenya, and they feel that all of that work in the US equipped them to now train surgeons in East Africa. And then I have other friends who spent 25 years working in East Africa who are now coming back and working in the United States. So I think it's always a mutual back and forth that however God's using you today, I'm sure you experience this in the work that you're doing, right? That it also opens up another door, another direction, another way to walk by faith. We don't kind of get walking by faith done and then check it off and move to the next thing. We just move to a different way of living it out.
Exactly. Well, we've been talking with Bethany Ferguson, author of The Mission-Centered Life, Following Jesus into the Broken Places, as she takes us on a journey of her own experience in the mission field, the questions, the challenges, the lessons she learned, and the questions that she has still today in regards to this, that this is not the guidebook for how to go become a missionary. This is actually the inner workings and some of the challenges, the thought processes that she shares with you to take you on a journey with her, for herself to ask herself what her current mission field and what's next for her, and to ask you to ask yourself what is your current mission field and what is next for you. Bethany Ferguson, thank you. Thank you for sharing this great work with us, The Mission-Centered Life, Following Jesus into the Broken Places.
Thank you so much.
God bless. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.